The question has arisen, what was student life like at Hiwassee College, say, in the 1850s? Well, first of all, it will probably surprise a great many people that there were no dorms. There exist advertisements in old newspapers that mention things like boarding is available with local families for $1.40 a month. That means that where did the students stay? They lived with families around the college. They boarded. People who more or less ran boarding houses. There was an old Mr. Frank McKenzie who ran a kind of boarding house across the road from Hiwassee College. I mentioned somewhat earlier that there was a kind of accommodation built for the campground meetings near the campus of Hiwassee College. And we hear that by the later 1850s, male students were living in that over the winter. And surprise, surprise, there was a problem. The young men were tearing boards off the sides of these buildings to burn for heat during the winter. And now, Dr. Bruner was the president of the college, and he had the duty of taking care of those buildings because those buildings belonged to the Methodist Church, and he was a Methodist minister. So it became Dr. Bruner's headache, let us say. Well, in the late 1850s, there occurred a kind of crisis between Bruner, as the president of the college, and the business aspects of the college, the people who were seeing to it. Well, it evolved into this. They couldn't pay Bruner very much, and he wanted more. And he wanted a boarding house built. Well, he threatened to resign, he threatened to leave, and demand his salary. Well, they couldn't pay his salary. So he worked out a deal. He was fairly well-to-do, but then he would finance the building of a boarding house if the board of the college would agree to give him everything in the way of actual profit that the college made for the next 8 years. And that's the deal they struck. And it was not a very good one, not a very stable one. In 1861, he left. Bruner, by then, was what we might call a much married man. He had a wife, and depending on what year we were talking about, 5 or 6 children. And he got another job. Now, back then, it's completely disappeared off the face of the earth now, but there was an institute called Strawberry Plains College, and he went there, and he was an assistant professor there. We've got wonderful letters written by Bruner's wife, Elizabeth, about the move and all of that, and about seeing the aurora borealis late at night and thinking this was a sign of the coming Civil War. And indeed, there was a Civil War coming. So, Bruner packs up his family, his wife and his children, and he moves to Strawberry Plains. And he gets a job there. He's the second banana there. Well, the plans for a boarding house go on. Bruner had the money. His brother-in-law, the younger son of the Key family, Fleming Key, was running a grocery store in Philadelphia, Tennessee. I like to think of Fleming as the ne'er-do-well in the Key family. Essentially, that's what he was. He was not a very prosperous fellow. Had a wife and several children and all that, but the best he could do was a small store in Philadelphia. When his older brother became Postmaster General, he offered him a job in the post office at Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And he took the job and packed up his family and moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and spent the last 30 years of his life at a useful job in the U.S. Post Office, thanks to his brother. But anyway, he was the one that was hired to build the dormitory. Unfortunately, no picture of this building survives. It seems to have been quite a nice, large building, but it was not going to be there very long. Here is what happened. Something you may have already heard of. The Civil War happened. Well, Monroe County, especially the area around Sweetwater, was really busy during the Civil War. There was a very, very important train tracks that went through Sweetwater. They ran from Virginia all the way down the Sweetwater Valley, down to Chattanooga, and ultimately Atlanta. Sweetwater itself became a major military depot. Food, ammunition, virtually everything an army needs was unloaded and stored in Sweetwater. And the commander of all of this, somebody you may have heard of, Tecumseh Sherman. War as Hell Sherman, as he might be called. Well, by 1862, Knoxville had fallen after a rather perfunctory defense to the Union. Well, Sherman, who was, of course, a Union general, heard a rumor that following as the siege of Chattanooga was broken up, that Confederate soldiers were moving up the valley toward Knoxville. Well, Sherman decided he'd better get there, as he liked to say, firstest with the mostest. So he moved his army up what is now called the Von Sweetwater Road, the one that's still there now. And by the way, by then there was a little school called Rockville Academy, and Bruner was teaching there part-time. And of course, as they walked by, somebody burned it down. They were always burning down things that belonged to Bruner. But anyway, Sherman moves his troops up the Sweetwater Von Road to Niles Ferry, so that they could use the ferry to cross the river and go to the defense of Knoxville. Problem was, he had been fooled. There was no army in immediate danger of Knoxville, so he had to come back. And when he came back, Tecumseh Sherman was in a nasty mood. He was not a man to be trifled with. In fact, he was so angry when he got back from the failed trip to defend Knoxville that didn't need defense. There was a path from Von all the way down that road to Sweetwater on a mile. For a mile on either side of the road was devastated. His army took everything. There was not a rasher of bacon left in the smokehouse. There was not a cup of flour left at the bottom of a barrel that Tecumseh Sherman's army did not take. It was a 2-mile wide stroke of utter devastation. As I said, before that house was built, that boarding house, they lived as boarders with people in the neighborhood. When Sherman got to Niles Ferry, there was a kind of dock where the ferry would dock. That collapsed into the river, and several soldiers were drowned. Well, Sherman was not happy, and he decided he needed a lot of wood to shore up that dock. And he went back to Hiwassee College, and his army tore down the boarding house. It vanished from the face of the earth. It was built into a dock at Niles Ferry. And there went the dream of a boarding house. So the students continued to live the best they could in that campground shelter, which they were slowly burning down piece by piece, and they continued to live until after the Civil War. Who were these people? Well, first of all, they were they were absolutely, in fact, male. Hiwassee was a male college until the 1900s. Many of them were older sons of prosperous family because it cost a good deal of money to go to college, and when a kid was going to college, he was not out picking cotton in the home cotton fields. I would say, if you want to think the typical students, you might think of people like Dr. Bruner's brothers-in-law, the Key family. Hiwassee College was almost entirely founded where it was just so those Key boys would have some place to go to college. And that's about the way they lived. I've talked about the debating societies. There were 2 debating societies, as I mentioned. Each one had its own library. And the library were kept in the top floor of the big brick house. And if you were studying for something, you had to pay about $1 a month to be in that debating society, and that gave you access to the libraries. When the Civil War finally did come down, the library of Hiwassee College was broken up and hidden in the homes of people that lived nearby, which was probably a good thing. There was, as many of you may not know, but there was a major skirmish at Philadelphia, Tennessee, not the one in Pennsylvania. It's a long, complicated story which has rather little to do with the college, but we're pretty sure that those who were injured on the Confederate side in that skirmish were brought to Hiwassee College, and it was used as a field hospital for some time. Basically, some years later, exactly what happened is not well known, but Bruner came back from his adventures in the Civil War, which I won't discuss here, but he found that the place was still standing. It had not been burned down, but the walls were covered with obscene graffiti. So, graffiti is not a new phenomenon. Though I suppose in those days, if you were lucky, the graffiti would be in Latin and nobody would be offended. But so that's what life was like. I think I've mentioned they generally started the day at about 9:30 in the morning. Young men would walk in if they were in walking distance, or if they were lucky and had a horse, they would ride in, and they would be there. And always, about 9:30, Dr. Bruner would assemble all the students of Hiwassee College in the big auditorium, the bottom floor of the brick building, and he would lead them in prayer. And it was, of course, a somewhat doctrinaire prayer. If the president of the college was a Methodist, he would pray like a Methodist. If he were a Presbyterian, he would pray like a Presbyterian. That was the way that the identity, the religious identity of a college was conveyed. If you had a Methodist president, it was a Methodist college. If you had a Presbyterian president, it was a Presbyterian college. And things would break up for a rather leisurely lunch about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There were no cafeterias. The students would bring whatever they could or whatever they had with them for their lunch, and they'd sit around and chew the fat, and that was pretty much what they had for lunch, fat. And finally, as the sun was going down, late afternoon, there would be another fairly brief prayer, and everybody went home. There was no place really for anybody to sleep. Maybe you had a sleeping bag or something, get out in the woods. It was rather Spartan, I would say.